Welcome back, everybody. This Week in America, website thisweekinamerica.us. As mentioned, our special guest on the program is Richard Dick Rose. He's been writing for over 70 years. He became thoroughly intrigued with the various styles of different writers. He would then even imitate the author's styles when writing book reports. In the summer of 1953, Dick attended Navy Journalist School. He spent over 17 years working in public relations, writing news releases featuring stories and speeches for military officers. While in Vietnam, he guided Navy journalists as well as other young writers and photographers. He spent a lot of time in the Mekong Delta writing feature stories on different Navy units. His first book was Movable Forts and Magazines. He's written other award-winning books. His newest is called Tarnished Brass Curtain, a novel of Vietnam. Back with us on This Week in America, Dick Rose. Dick, welcome back to the program. Great to have you with us.
Well, I'm glad to be back.
It's interesting, the book that you've written. I really like this, Tarnished Brass Curtain, a novel of Vietnam. The book is available, of course, at Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Interested people can look at our website as well, thisweekinamerica.us, and link on for that information. Dick's website is dickroseawardwinningbooks.com. Just briefly on your background, you've been involved in writing since basically back in your elementary school days where you really liked it. And after you retired from the Navy, you went back to college, got your master's degree in English, and you basically been writing books ever since.
Yeah, I re-released Movable Forts and Magazines as Tarnished Brass Curtain. I shortened it up because it was my master's thesis and had to be more literary, and I tried to make it a little more commercial and cut to the chase more quickly.
Yeah, and it's really a fascinating book, and let's set the stage for this. And I mentioned your background in Vietnam, so this is something, and working in public information, it's something you're very familiar with. This takes place basically, over a one-week period in 1968.
Yeah, I formulated this, what they call a frame story, which covers the possible, at that point, the possible defection of an admiral's son who's a helicopter pilot, home for his mother's funeral, and goes underground rather than return to his unit in Vietnam. And that's one of the stories. The other story has to do with the Jewish Navy chief journalist who is in love with words and not aware always of their consequences and may have influenced, and he's worried that he may have influenced the pilot because he had been spending a lot of time talking to the pilot. They were friends. And he talked about the language of Vietnam where nobody is killed. They're greased or wasted, or a bunch of other terms.
Right.
And they're never people. They're different pejoratives.
Well, I mentioned this covers a week, and it said primarily at a naval base in California, and you have some flashbacks as well in the course of the story. And the book is Tarnished Brass Curtain.
Right. The flashbacks concern where the chief and the lieutenant are talking, and the lieutenant's asking Dan, my chief, about Vietnam, because the lieutenant has orders to Vietnam, and Dan has already served his tour in the Mekong Delta, incidentally. So it's somewhat, I somewhat have injected myself into the story.
I was going to say, to some level, autobiographical. We talked about it the last time on. You actually talk about a mission in the Mekong Delta, and you weren't sure you were going to come back from that. That was a rather harrowing experience.
Yeah, and I mentioned that in the book. I I don't fictionalize it. It's actually taken from one of my stories, and I just sort of put the pilot in the middle of it rather than me. But so we landed on a refueling bladder. Actually, it's a 50,000-gallon underground jet fuel bladder, and we started to get rocketed. And also, there was a satchel charge that was to be command detonated once the 4 helicopters were on the pad. And so I incorporated that into the story. But, yeah, we came within about 5 minutes of getting blown up.
Yeah, that's all in the book, Tarnished Brass Curtain, a novel of Vietnam. Our guest on the program is Richard Dick Rose. His website is dickroseawardwinningbooks.com. The book's available now at Amazon, all the usual places, and you can link onto our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and get information. Let's talk about the 2 main characters in the book, and this is interesting because it takes you back to Vietnam. In fact, in some of the reviews, they talk about sort of a different side of the story, the personalities involved. It takes you back to Vietnam. And we've got the lies and the deception. And let's talk about the 2 main characters. Fred Hetherington, who's a young lieutenant, that's who you talked about, is home for his mother's funeral, and Dan Levin. In talking about Fred, there really was a lot of, we see a transition there, don't we? We see a certain maturity as he's going through this whole process of deciding what he wants to do and whether or not he's even going to go back to Vietnam.
Yeah. It's a little difficult to put that, but after he reads in the newspaper that his co-pilot and his close friend in Vietnam was killed, and at the point of his saying, was it worth it? And then he thinks about, again, about the fact that the Americans weren't really supported by the Vietnamese. And so essentially they were fighting to support a dictator. Now, he doesn't say that, but that was the general idea. And the Vietnamese, until the Tet Offensive, the people in Saigon, the war wasn't there. The war was across the river, and it was known as the Americans' War. It was even referred to that in the Vietnamese parliament as the Americans' War, until the Viet Cong attacked Saigon.
Well, as Fred is deciding what he's going to do, and again mentioned he was home for his mother's funeral, and he's the very prominent son of the admiral. He decides what he's going to go underground for a while, and he ends up with an anti-war group, and then realizes he's being what basically used as a propaganda tool at that point.
Yeah, he's being manipulated. And that's when he discovers that the anti-war group doesn't really understand the war any more than his father did. And the military command in the States really understood. They have sort of a warped view, and the underground group, they talk about Marxism, and they talk about the imperialist American, and this is the anti-war group, the imperialist Americans who are dividing up the shoreline for oil drilling. And so he realizes that he's in a bad predicament. He's committed himself, he hasn't returned, so he's now AWOL, and he starts to think that maybe he should have done a little more thinking before he was so abrupt in just deciding not to return.
Well, during all of this, what Dan, the older senior chief journalist in charge there, he's getting some media requests like we understand he hasn't gone back or he's not going to go back. So he's in this predicament. What's he going to do basically to protect the admiral at this point who is still mourning the death of his wife?
Yeah, well, the chief of staff, who has no real faith in Dan, the chief of the public affairs office. The chief of staff is trying to keep the story from the admiral because he doesn't want to disturb him, because he is mourning the death of his wife. And even though the press, the anti-war group, has leaked the fact that the lieutenant went underground. The chief of staff is trying to keep that from the admiral. He says, well, we'll take care of everything and get him back, and there's no need to bother the admiral about it.
Yeah, and as you...
That is the tarnished brass curtain. The brass curtain that lower officers try to shield the guy in charge from any bad news.
Well, and then in the book, The Tarnished Brass Curtain, a novel of Vietnam, you write about the, Dan is concerned that he is thinking, and he may be the cause of Lieutenant Hetherington's action, and then he's worried about this could jeopardize a promotion for him.
Right. He's worried that if it gets out that he might have influenced Fred, the pilot, and he might have influenced him, and this could damage. He knows he's being promoted, but then the promotion doesn't take place for another couple of months, and they could stop that at any time. And that has him worried personally. And his wife blasts him because of his love of words without considering the consequences. He's into such people as, Antigone, who opposes authority, and the original title, as I said, was Movable Forts and Magazines, which was a quote from On Civil Disobedience by Thoreau. And it says, we have these men who are marching off to war. It's a damnable thing they do. And he quotes that. It's a damnable thing that they do. Are they men at all, or merely movable forts and magazines being used by unscrupulous leaders? And so Dan, as I say, Dan is in love with words, and he's also a connoisseur of words. And that's where they get into, and while he's in Vietnam, Fred sees some of the racism that takes place in trying to not only dehumanize the enemy, but dehumanize their friends too.
And the book comes to a resolution, and we will let you read a copy of that. We won't go any further with the storyline. The book is Tarnished Brass Curtain, a novel of Vietnam. Our guest on the program is Dick Rose. His website, dickroseawardwinningbooks.com. If you go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble online, you'll get information on Dick and the other books. They are award-winning books. They are excellent. This one in particular, the newest, Tarnished Brass Curtain. Let's talk a little bit, a few minutes remaining in the program. And I find it interesting as you're capturing Dan Levin, the older senior chief journalist in charge. You, as I mentioned, were a master chief journalist. And you so often think, you don't really think about words, and maybe there are 3 or 4 words you can use, and you sort of choose one and overlook the others. Did you go through a period when you were writing to be really cautious about the words you chose, not to get too wordy, and not to say anything that could be inflammatory in any way?
Yeah. We were constantly playing with words in Vietnam. Once every hooch, every brass hut or bamboo hut that was shot up became, in our news reports, a fortified bunker. And so we actually would get action reports from the helicopter pilots where they had shot up so many fortified bunkers, so many VC fishnets. Now, how a fishnet becomes VC, I never quite understood. But these were actuals. And then we had our free fire zones, which in the beginning when I arrived, they were known as free fire zones. That means that anybody found in that particular zone was considered the enemy. Now, it could have been a fisherman who decided that since I was off limits, it might be pretty good fishing because nobody else was using it. But it was a free fire zone. Later on, while I was still there, the official word came out from General Westmoreland's headquarters that they were now known as special zones. So they were still playing with words.
And you don't really think about that, but the responsibility that you had, a word or phrase that you use, it could be inflammatory or it could be just descriptive depending on how you used it and the context you used it. There was a lot of responsibility on what you were writing, not only for the troops there, but for the U.S. press that was watching what you were saying and people back in the States.
Well, yeah, the stuff that we wrote back in the States was mostly about the men and the units and what they were doing. But the censorship, and there was censorship because I was head of the news bureau for Armed Forces Radio Tokyo, and for instance, on Armed Forces Radio Tokyo, the Watts riots never took place. Even as they were going on, we were never allowed to mention them. And back in 1954, I believe, when I was news director of Armed Forces Radio Taiwan, we were never allowed to mention Little Rock.
Interesting.
So there was a lot of censorship going on.
So in the book, you discuss in great detail lies and deception in the fiction that actually was going on in real life as well during that time.
Yeah. It always is. It was never known as censorship. It was known as selective editing. The theory being there's always more news than is available to what you can broadcast, so you select what you broadcast. And sometimes it got a little silly. When I was in Taiwan, again, this isn't about the book, but when I was in Taiwan as head of the news department and the chief news writer, we couldn't mention the divorce of a movie star, I believe it was Susan Hayward, because it would imply that Americans had unhappy marriages. The embassy cut out that story. Fairly innocuous story, but that's what we dealt with.
How frustrating as a journalist was that? I can see as a journalist when you're protecting lives and it's important to selectively edit a story, selectively report, but something like that, and it's like, what in the world? Why can't we report this? Why has this been edited? How difficult was that as a journalist to balance all of that?
Well, it was difficult because, especially in Tokyo, where I had a bunch of mixed military. We had Army, Navy, Air Force, and if I ran into, as I did, one rebel, and that was another silly thing. We had the Japanese demonstrating the arrival of a nuclear submarine. That was about 1967 or 66 or 67, nuclear submarine, and there were Japanese riding outside the naval base. It was being carried on Japanese television, but we couldn't report it on Armed Forces Radio.
Amazing. And here's a period in time when you are in charge, you've got people that are working under you. How difficult is that? Because it's not just self-editing that you have to do. You're watching to make sure that the others are following in line as they're supposed to be doing as well.
Yeah, because ultimately I'm in charge, and I did get one of my news writers, the guy on the midnight shift, did broadcast that story about the riots. And so I got called on the carpet for it.
Is it difficult? Is it difficult when the people that are working for you are like questioning, why do we have to do it this way? Why can't we do it that way? When you happen to be pretty much in agreement with the reporters, is there just a time when you say, shut up and do like I tell you, rather than in some cases it's probably not even defensible?
Yeah, And my particular leadership style was very, what do I call it? Lobo leadership. I mean, one of my guys, he was about 6'4" to my 5'8", and he did broadcast it. And it was difficult to get through to him. I finally told him that if he ever broadcast something like that again against my orders, I would crawl up on a desk and slug him. And that seemed to have gotten through to him. He started laughing, and he agreed that he'd follow my orders.
Sometimes there's nothing better than humor to fall back on when you certainly aren't in a position, kicking him in the shin or jumping up on the desk. You've got to do something to even the playing field. Unfortunately, out of time. It's been a fascinating discussion. The book is excellent. Tarnished Brass Curtain, a novel of Vietnam. It's authored by our guest on the program, Dick Rose, Richard Rose. The book is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all bookstores around the country. Information, and you can link on to all of the information at our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Dick's website is very simple, Dick Rose Award-Winning Books, and he's had a number of them, dickroseawardwinningbooks.com. Dick, congratulations on an excellent new book, Tarnished Brass Curtain, a novel of Vietnam. Great having you back on the program, and we look forward to talking with you again. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed our talk.
You're listening to This Week in America, website thisweekinamerica.us.